Welcome to the roar that haunted an entire front line, a weapon that men whispered about in fear. They called it the Hitler's Buzzsaw, the MG42. Its barrels spun like a demon in the mud, hurling 200 rounds per minute, tearing through foxholes, barbed wire, and the very courage of those who faced it. Some said the air itself shivered with each burst. Soldiers later wrote in diaries about the moment they heard it, the ground trembling, the trees snapping, and the seconds stretching into eternity. October 1944. Western Europe. The Ardennes forests and French farmlands were scarred by artillery fire and smoke. Fog rolled in low across shattered hedgerows. Engines of tanks and half-tracks coughed and roared. Bullets cracked through the air. Boots sank in mud rifles, jammed radios hissed. The German soldiers, overstretched and undersupplied, braced for the relentless pressure of Allied divisions advancing in overwhelming numbers. Outgunned, outproduced, outmaneuvered, yet they clung to their positions, clutching MG42s, their lifeline and terror. The machine was more than steel and mechanics. It was a legend on the front line. Whispers of its speed and precision traveled faster than bullets themselves. A young corporal wrote, "The gun fired before I could blink. The world narrowed to its roar." And then silence. If I was lucky. The MG42 had become both guardian and curse, its echo shaping the fate of villages and fields alike. Before we move deeper into the forest of history, take a breath. Imagine the roar, the mud, the smoke, the fear pressing in from all sides. And now, tell me, where are you watching from? What hour is it where you sit, as the echoes of this machine reach across time to you? Leave your comment, share the moment, and step into the trenches of 1944 with us. October 1944. Western Europe was a continent consumed by fire and fog. The Ardennes forests lay heavy with mist, each tree shrouded in smoke from artillery, each hedgerow a potential death trap. The ground was churned, mud, churned by the tracks of tanks and half-tracks, churned by the boots of soldiers who had marched days without rest. Overhead, the droning hum of reconnaissance planes mingled with the distant rumble of bombers. Their shadows flickered across the fields, ghostly reminders of the air that dominated the battlefield. German positions braced against a tide they could barely imagine. The MG42s lined the trenches, the foxholes, the ruined farmhouses, a metallic heartbeat amid chaos. Fog rolled in thick, settling over the Rhine and the Meuse, clinging to the scarred landscapes of villages burned to rubble. Engines roared in the distance, carrying men and weapons closer to confrontation. The sun broke in pale streaks over barbed wire and broken fences, light glinting off spent shells and the rifled steel of weapons. Each morning brought new fear, each dusk a reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. Soldiers whispered of the gun that had earned its name, a machine so fast, so precise that men swore it had a will of its own. The German army, once an organized juggernaut, was now stretched to its limits. Supply lines faltered under the weight of Allied pressure. Ammunition ran low. Fuel shortages grounded vehicles. Yet orders remained absolute. The MG42 became the keystone of their defensive strategy. A single gunner, a single barrel could dictate the pace of an entire assault. For every Allied squad advancing across the mud, for every tank cresting a ridge, there was a gunner ready to unleash hell. And the soldiers knew it. The fear of the MG42 was not merely rumor. It was measured in seconds, in the cadence of bullets, in the shadows of fallen comrades. In the villages, the shell-pocked streets whispered stories. Civilians' long-gone homes, abandoned barns, gutted by fire. Only the echoes remained. The local children who survived would later tell tales of shadows moving through smoke of trees, vibrating with 1,000 invisible impacts. The folklore of fear became entwined with the fact of war. Every MG42 emplacement became a legend. "That ridge is cursed," said one sergeant in a torn notebook. "The bullets have eyes. They come for you before you see them." And yet for every whispered tale, there was the cold precision of engineering. Barrels spun belts fed rounds, recoil tamed by the genius of a single design. Allied intelligence noted the gun's efficiency. Reports tallied hundreds of casualties in minutes during engagements along the Siegfried Line. The enemy fire appeared almost supernatural. Men fell as if an invisible hand guided each bullet typed a dispatch. Engineers marveled at the air-cooled design, the rapid change barrel, the simplicity and ruggedness that allowed it to function under mud, rain, and snow. Fact and legend blended in the accounts of those who survived, if survival could be called that. Every morning men would emerge into landscapes of shattered forests. Where once there had been orchards and fields, now there were craters and mangled wire. Smoke hung low, drifting through twisted beams and shattered roofs. The smell of cordite and burned metal was pervasive, clinging to skin and uniform. Boots sank into mud rifles jammed with grit radios coughed static. And through it all, the metallic chatter of the MG42 rang. A heartbeat, a threat, a promise. Some said they could predict its pattern. Some said no one could. Yet even amid the horror, human moments persisted. A medic slipping through the mud to reach the wounded. A lieutenant shouting orders over the cacophony. A young private trembling as he loaded belt after belt. The MG42 was a presence that forced each man to confront his mortality. And yet it was also a tool, a protector, a last line of defense against the onslaught. The paradox of technology in warfare and salvation intertwined in cold steel and spinning barrels. The landscape itself became a character. Forests, rivers, ridges, towns, all shaped by the ebb and flow of combat. Some ridges were called death knolls by men who survived only to tell the tale. Streams ran red mud thickened with blood, and rain, artillery shells left cratered scars in fields. And over it all, the roar of the MG42 cut through the fog, marking each engagement, shaping every tactic. From Normandy's Bocage to the open fields near Aachen, the gun dictated life and death. The folklore surrounding it, the gun that never sleeps, the devil's own rifle, was born not from imagination alone, but from the brutal truth of the battlefield. For the Germans, it was a symbol of hope. A chance to hold lines against overwhelming numbers. For the Allies, it was terror incarnate. And for historians and engineers, it became a case study of the interplay between man, machine, and environment. One could track the course of a battle simply by tracing the sound of its barrels. The cadence of fire, the rhythm of defense, the pattern of survival, all told in mechanical heartbeat. And so, October 1944 was not just a month of advancing troops and artillery fire. It was a month of calculated fear, of human endurance stretched to the limit. Soldiers spoke of mornings where the mist made it impossible to see beyond 10 meters. Yet the MG42 found them. They spoke of nights lit only by tracer fire and burning buildings. Yet the machine's roar guided every action. It was as if the forest itself had learned to anticipate the gun. And in some whispered accounts, the very earth shivered beneath it. As you imagine this scene, fog rolling mud, sucking boots, distant shells thudding, and the relentless chatter of the MG42, pause and breathe. Picture the men, their hands gripping rifles, hearts hammering, eyes wide with fear and resolve. Picture the machines spinning and feeding, metallic and unstoppable. And now, tell me, where are you watching from? What hour is it where you sit as the echoes of this front line reach across decades? Leave your comment, share the moment, and step into the Ardennes, into the mud, into the roar of 1944. The MG42, born from the crucible of necessity, designed for speed, durability, and lethality, every component had a purpose. Every barrel spun with a rhythm that men could fear and respect in equal measure. It was belt-fed, air-cooled, capable of firing up to 200 rounds per minute. A single gunner could lay down a wall of lead, enough to stop an advancing platoon in its tracks. And yet, it was not merely the numbers. It was the psychology of the weapon. The metallic chatter of the barrels, the staccato of rounds leaving the muzzle. It drilled into minds as much as flesh. Soldiers later recalled the first time they heard it, the air seeming to shiver, the ground vibrating, trees snapping under unseen force. From the factory records in Zella-Melis, engineers documented every aspect. The MG42's rapid change barrel allowed a trained gunner to replace an overheated barrel in seconds. Unlike its predecessor, the MG34, which jammed under sustained fire, the MG42 was designed to endure. It could function in mud, rain, snow, extreme temperatures. The Germans called it Hitler's Säge for a reason. Saw, teeth, ripping through reality. Each unit was stamped with a serial number. Each round tested and calibrated. Precision married to mass production. The Allies quickly learned to fear its cadence. Reports from Normandy in July 1944 detailed waves of casualties in minutes. Men fell as if an invisible hand guided the bullets, typed an intelligence officer. Engineers dissected captured examples, marveling at its simplicity. The recoil-operated action, the fluted barrel, the belt feed, all combined to produce a machine that was both easy to maintain and devastating in effect. A single MG42 could cover an entire field, control a ridge, and instill fear that spread faster than any infantry assault. Field manuals emphasized the gun's rate of fire, its effective range, and the tactics for deployment. But in practice, few manuals could prepare a soldier for the sound, the violence, the panic. One corporal wrote, "You don't hear it at first, then it's everywhere. The world narrows, and the world ends, if you're not fast enough." Some said the MG42 seemed almost alive, responding to the chaos, choosing targets. And while folklore grew around the battlefield, the fact remained. Statistics confirmed its terror. Hundreds of men struck down in minutes. Objectives halted. Momentum broken. Industrial output during 1943 to 1944 ensured a steady supply. Thousands of units rolled from factories, each subjected to rigorous testing. Each belt of ammunition contained 50 rounds, carefully lubricated and inspected. During training, gunners learned to maintain the rhythm, to anticipate barrel overheating, to conserve life, and to unleash it. The gun demanded respect and inspired myth. A German diary noted, "It spits faster than you can feed it, faster than you can think. Yet it is loyal to those who understand it." Combat reports detailed precise effects. At the Hurtgen Forest, one MG42 emplacement reportedly cut down 3 squads in under 2 minutes. Elsewhere in the bocage of Normandy, machine gunners halted armored advances until engineers cleared paths. Field engineers documented the number of barrels, produced the ammunition, expended the rate of deployment. 7th of 500 MG42s produced in 1943 alone, each capable of shredding infantry formations. Each gunner became a force multiplier, each barrel a heartbeat, and every battle a testament to design meeting necessity. The weapon's speed altered tactics. Infantry learned to move in short bounds. Tanks advanced under smoke screens. Counter-battery fire sought the guns. Yet for every counter, the MG42 adapted. Changing positions, alternating gunners, synchronized bursts. It was mechanical yet tactical, It forced decision-making under pressure. It dictated the tempo of war, and sometimes dictated life or death. Even Allied soldiers could not deny its engineering. Technical manuals from the U.S. Army noted, the MG42's cyclic rate exceeds 1,000 rounds per minute. Air-cooled design permits extended fire. Rapid change barrel reduces stoppage. The psychological impact is as significant as its physical effects. Engineers traced the design lineage to the MG34, but improvements made the MG42 reliable under conditions that would render others useless. Rain, mud, freezing, cold, shell shock. It persisted. A metal heartbeat in a war of exhaustion, folklore, and fact intertwined. Soldiers swore bullets arrived before they saw the muzzle flash. Foxholes were lucky if they survived a burst. Yet in documents, numbers told the truth. One company expended 15,000 rounds in a single defensive operation. Another 10,000 across 3 successive assaults. Casualty reports, objective delays, retreats, all bore the mark of the MG42. And still stories circulated. Of guns that never tired. Of barrels that spun like the hands of fate. Of infantry frozen mid-step. Each narrative grounded in the terrifying precision of reality. The MG42 demanded mastery. Training manuals emphasized prone firing, tripod stabilization, barrel changes under fire target acquisition. Soldiers who mastered it could dominate open fields, cover retreats, create corridors of safety, or kill with mechanical certainty. And yet the stories of its fear were as important as the facts. Young privates whispered of its cadence. Seasoned NCOs respected it. Officers counted on it. And for those who faced it, survival was often a matter of seconds. In the forests, fields, and towns of Western Europe, it defined engagements. It shaped campaigns. It influenced strategy. The Allies altered formations, moved under cover-timed assaults. They respected the weapon's reputation, and the Germans, exhausted, hungry, outnumbered, leaned on it as both lifeline and psychological anchor. The MG42, a marriage of engineering industry and battlefield necessity, had become legend. And the legend was true. As you listen, imagine the barrels spinning, the rattle filling the air, the rhythm that dictated action and fear. Picture the gunners, trained, exhausted, human. Picture the men advancing, hearts racing, hearing the machine before they see it. And now, breathe. Absorb the fact, the engineering, the myth. The MG42 was a weapon of unparalleled design and a symbol of desperation. Its echo carried through forests, villages, and across decades, waiting for those who would step into its story. They were boys, mostly, some barely 20, some old enough to know better, all swallowed by the roar of the front. The MG42 was their heartbeat, their sentence, their salvation. Corporal Hans Weber had been awake for 36 hours. His hands were blistered from feeding the belt, his uniform stiff with mud and smoke. He crouched in the foxhole, just a slit carved into the clay, his world reduced to steel smoke and the steady vibration of the gun. Around him, the forest hissed with falling rain, the faint drip from leaves mixing with the rhythmic clatter of metal. He whispered a prayer not for victory, but for the barrel not to jam. Because when the MG42 spoke, it kept them alive, and when it fell silent, men died. The Allied advance pushed through the morning fog. American infantry crept along a hedgerow near Aachen helmets, low rifles raised. They'd learned the sound by now, a distinct rip like canvas tearing under lightning. The veterans could tell the distance by the pitch, the nearness by the way the air shook. Hit the dirt, someone yelled, but the bullets were already there. Private James Carver dove into a ditch, heart hammering against the mud. "It's that damn saw again," he shouted, voice cracking over the roar. He pressed his face into the earth, the smell of wet soil and cordite mingling in his lungs. He could hear the gun just ahead spitting in short bursts, 3 seconds, then silence, then 3, again controlled, disciplined. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a German gunner smiled through the exhaustion. In another trench, a medic named Otto knelt beside a wounded comrade. The man's leg was gone, just cloth and blood and silence. Otto's hands trembled as he bandaged what was left. The MG42 roared again, closer this time, the sound like thunder cracking inside his chest. He didn't flinch. Not anymore. After months of battle, the roar was part of him, an organ, a pulse. Across the line, the Allies adapted. Engineers laid smoke artillery, zeroed in on suspected nests. But the Germans were ghosts. They fired, moved, vanished. Each nest was manned by 2, the gunner and the loader. They lived in sync, breathing the same rhythm, sharing the same fear. When one blinked, the other ducked. When one cursed, the other smiled. Survival depended on precision and trust. Hans and his loader Dieter had fired together since Normandy. They joked that the MG42 was their third companion, temperamental, hungry, and loud. "She eats faster than we do," Dieter muttered once, threading a new belt through the feed. Hans grinned through cracked lips. "And she's prettier than you." They laughed because laughter was the only rebellion left. At dusk, they'd trade cigarettes for silence. The world would fade into the hum of insects, the far-off echo of artillery, and the ghostly glow of flares over the ridge. Hans would clean the gun with mechanical reverence, each piece wiped, oiled, reassembled. He treated it like a relic, a living thing. He'd seen it jam once in the rain outside Caen. 20 men died before he fixed it. Since then, his care bordered on devotion. In the American camp, soldiers wrote letters home. "There's a sound here," one wrote, "that you never forget. It's like a buzzsaw through heaven itself. They say if you hear it, it's already too late." Another wrote simply, "If you see the muzzle flash, you're the lucky one." Those letters never made the front pages, but they told the truth better than any report. Somewhere near Hürtgen, the forest burned that night. Trees snapped like bones. Snow mixed with ash. Allied tanks rolled forward, the treads crushing frozen soil, their engines drowning out the wind. Inside, one Sergeant Alvarez wiped condensation from the sight and whispered to his crew, "Keep your ears sharp. That gun's faster than we are." The MG42 opened fire moments later. Sparks ricocheted off the armor. The sound was less like shooting, more like screaming metal. Hans's position was nearly overrun. His ammunition was low, only 2 belts left. Dieter's face was pale under the grime. "We can't hold them," he said quietly. Hans nodded. He could feel the tremor in the gun's frame, the heat radiating through his gloves. "We'll hold until she stops singing," he said. It wasn't bravado, it was faith. When the order came to retreat, Hans didn't hear it. The radio was gone, the antenna sheared off by shell fire. He fired until the last belt ran empty. The forest fell silent. Only the hiss of smoke remained. Dieter was gone somewhere in the crater to his left. Hans sat still, staring at the gun. Its barrel glowed faintly red. He touched it with his sleeve, burned his hand, didn't care. "You did well," he murmured. Later, Allied patrols found the nest. The MG42 still in place, the barrel warped, the belt fused to the feed. 2 helmets, one overturned. They noted the precision tripod stable sights aligned. The officer wrote in his report, "Enemy machine gun position neutralized. Fought to the end." He didn't know their names, but he felt the story lingering in the smoke. On the other side of the line, Private Carver leaned against a tree, cigarette shaking in his hand. The gunfire had stopped. That was the one, he said softly. "The saw's gone quiet." For a moment no one spoke. Then someone laughed short, nervous. Maybe they finally ran out of hell. But Carver knew better. The sound would come again somewhere else, another ridge, another dawn. The war wasn't done with them yet. Historians later pieced together fragments, reports, diaries, battlefield maps. They found patterns. MG42 nests positioned at choke points flanking trails overlooking river crossings. Each position claimed dozens of lives before being silenced. The efficiency was brutal. But behind those numbers were faces: Hans Dieter Otto Carver, men bound by circumstance, by orders, by survival. When the guns fell silent for good, in May 1945, many of the gunners returned to ruins. Some rebuilt lives. Others carried the sound with them, the rhythm of the MG42 echoing in their dreams. One veteran wrote years later, "I can still hear it when I close my eyes." Not the sound itself, but the way it made me feel. Small, mortal, aware. And so the human story behind the steel remained. Beneath every statistic was a trembling hand, a cracked voice, a fleeting thought of home. The MG42 was never just a weapon, it was the space between man and machine, between fear and function. It was the proof that even in war's coldest moments, the heart still beats fast, fragile, and human. By late 1944, the balance of power was mathematical, cold, unforgiving. For every MG42 that Germany placed on a ridge, the Allies rolled forward with 10 Shermans, 20 half-tracks, and an endless stream of men and material. Outgunned, outproduced, outnumbered. Yet for those who faced the gun, none of that seemed to matter. Because in that moment between breath and impact, the MG42 still ruled the field. Factories in Germany worked through the night, machines clanging under the dim light of candles and air raid sirens. Each gun cost just a fraction of what it took to build a tank, and yet could hold one at bay for hours. In numbers, the contrast was staggering. By 1944, the United States had produced nearly 700,000 ton Browning M1919 machine guns. Germany had barely fielded 400,000 MG42s, and still on every front, their roar echoed louder. Where the Allies had volume, the Germans had velocity. Where the Allies had mass, the Germans had mechanics. It was a race of numbers against precision, and the clock was ticking. Allied reports from Normandy described the gun's signature as a blur of sound. At 200 rounds per minute, the ear could no longer separate individual shots. It was a continuous scream of metal. Bullets tore through air at 800 feet per second, fast enough to cut down a line of men before a shout became a word. The MG42 was not just a weapon. It was a tempo, the rhythm of war itself. One that every soldier had to learn to move with or die against. In contrast, the American M1919 fired at roughly 500 rounds per minute, half the speed, half the terror. British Vickers guns were reliable, but slow, their tripods anchored like old rituals from a different century. Where the Allies relied on coordination, artillery creeping, air support, raining fire, the German line still depended on the singular fury of the MG42. It turned hills into walls, fields into graves, seconds into centuries. Yet the price of that power was unsustainable. Each barrel lasted barely 400 rounds before melting. Each gun needed a team of 2, sometimes 3, to keep it alive: a loader, a spotter, a gunner. In those final months, Germany had fewer men for each gun than the gun demanded. They fed it with their strength, their sleep, their hope. Factories sent metal, the front paid in flesh. Field reports show how the rhythm of war changed. An Allied company would advance, then halt under the buzz and call in artillery. Each burst of fire meant a position found. Each silence meant a gun overheated, or its crew gone. It became a deadly conversation across the valleys, steel talking to fire. When artillery hit, the Germans moved again, dragging their tripods to new angles, resetting the tempo. Every battle was a symphony of adaptation, call, and response between fear and machine. The contrast deepened in the factories. In America, production lines hummed under electric lights, coffee cups, and assembly charts. In Germany, under bombed-out roofs and flickering lamps, women and old men worked by hand to forge barrels from recycled metal. By 1945, each gun was a miracle of persistence. Some were assembled without serial numbers, without inspection, sent straight to the front. The sound never changed, though. That was the cruel beauty of the design. Even in collapse, it functioned perfectly. War Department interviews after the war recorded astonishment. American soldiers described capturing MG42s and turning them against their former owners. They called it the best damn gun we ever feared. Engineers took notes, measurement samples, and from those notes the future was built. The M60, the Belgian MAG, the Swiss MG41, each a descendant of that German machine. Even today, its DNA flows through modern weapons. The Buzzsaw never truly fell silent. Contrast that is the heart of this story. The contrast between the human and the mechanical. The tired hands feeding belts into the mouth of a machine they both loved and feared. Between a nation crumbling and a weapon still flawless in its duty. Between numbers on a factory ledger and the heartbeat of a gunner in a trench. And in that contrast, the truth of 1944 emerges, a war not only of armies, but of sound and tempo, of industrial faith and individual terror. On the Allied side, they adapted. Smoke screens grew thicker. Artillery barrages became longer. Flanking maneuvers grew bolder. For every burst of the MG42, there was a counterburst from howitzers and Typhoon fighter bombers. In the skies, numbers ruled. On the ground, speed still belonged to the Germans. It was the old story of war quantity against quality, and both sides paid in men. Historians later measured the efficiency. One MG42 crew could deliver the same volume of fire as an entire platoon of riflemen. But those crews were exhausted, malnourished, frozen. The machine never failed. The men did. Barrels were changed with bare hands, flesh burning on steel. Belts jammed with mud. Snow froze feed mechanisms. Still they fired. Still they held. It was as if the machine demanded sacrifice and received it willingly. Every army needs a myth. The MG42 was both weapon and myth in one. For the Germans, it was a proof that superiority still existed, that somewhere in the rubble excellence remained. For the Allies, it was the devil at the edge of the forest, a sound that warned them they were close to hell. When the war ended, both sides remembered it not as a weapon, but as a presence. The contrast of 1944 was final and cruel. Germany had the machine, but the Allies had the means. For every MG42 that roared, a dozen factories burned behind it. For every barrel changed, a bridge was lost, a city encircled, a hope extinguished. No amount of precision could stop the weight of production for rolling from the west and the east. In the end, the sound of the buzzsaw was drowned not by silence, but by the deeper, steadier hum of victory's machines. Still, when veterans spoke of the war decades later, they did not speak of tanks or airplanes first. They spoke of that sound, the rattle, the fear. The instant when time broke and instinct took over. They spoke of how it changed the way men moved, the way they thought, the way they remembered. And perhaps that is the real measure of power, not in the steel, but in the memory it creates. Outgunned versus outproduced. Precision versus quantity. Fear versus fire. The numbers told one story, the sound told another. And in that sound, that mechanical, inhuman symphony of the MG42, the entire war found its echo. The end came not with silence, but with exhaustion. The fields of Europe lay broken. charred skeletons of forests, shattered spires of churches, and guns, thousands of them abandoned in the mud. Among them, the MG42 rested like a sleeping beast. Its barrel blackened, its feed jammed with dirt, the echo of its last burst still hanging somewhere between sky and smoke. By spring of 1945, the war machine that had birthed it was gone. Berlin was burning. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years had collapsed in 1,000 days of retreat. What remained, what endured, was sound. Veterans later said they could still hear it, in their dreams, in passing trains, in the beat of their hearts when thunder rolled too close. The Buzzsaw outlived the battlefield it ruled. Factories that once forged its barrels now lay in ruins. Allied engineers walked through the smoldering workshops of Mauser and Gustloff Werke, collecting blueprints and broken molds. They found stacks of parts, half-finished machines halted mid-production, tools frozen where hands had dropped them during air raids. One officer described the scene. It was as if time itself stopped mid-burst, but the design did not die there. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence gathered everything: the guns, the data, the men who built them. Reports from the U.S. Ordnance Department called the MG42 a technical masterpiece, its firing rate unmatched, its simplicity revolutionary. What began as the weapon of an empire became the blueprint for armies across the world. The MG42's spirit lived on in the American M60, in the Belgian MAG, in the Swiss MG51, and later in the German Bundeswehr's MG3. The Buzzsaw was reborn under new flags, new uniforms, new doctrines. But for the men who had carried it, there was no rebirth. There was only memory, and the quiet weight of what they'd survived. Hans Weber, the gunner, whose hands had once known every rhythm of the machine, returned to Dresden after the war. The city was gone. Rubble where streets had been. He found his mother's house a crater. He never spoke of the MG42 again. Neighbors remembered him fixing bicycles for children. Never weapons. In his shed beneath a blanket lay the gun's handle, the only part he had taken home. Across the ocean, Private Carver, the American, who had faced that sound on the hedgerows of France, kept a different relic. A single 7-point 2mm casing, polished to gold, set on his mantle. That sound taught me respect, he once told a reporter. Not for them. For survival. When he died in 1978, his family found a note tucked behind a photograph from Aachen. It read simply, "I can still hear it." In archives across Europe, researchers catalogued the aftermath, the statistics, the production numbers, the post-war adoption rates. But behind the data lay something intangible, the emotional legacy of the weapon. It had redefined what fear meant on the battlefield. It had changed tactics, psychology, memory. Armies learned to move differently because of it, to scatter, to crawl, to hide in the rhythm of bursts. The MG42 had reshaped war into sound and speed, and that sound had consequences far beyond 1945. Every post-war weapon carried echoes of it. The Cold War began with weapons built in its image, streamlined, efficient mechanical perfection. Yet no matter how modern, none could escape its ghost. The Buzzsaw was more than a machine. It was the industrial soul of total war, the proof that fear could be engineered. Historians would later debate whether its perfection symbolized brilliance or madness, a marvel of design born from the ruin of conscience. It represented everything the war had become: efficient, dehumanized, fast. The MG42 did not distinguish between soldier and shadow. It erased them both with equal precision. And in that erasure lay the paradox of modern war, the triumph of engineering over empathy. In post-war Germany, silence became reverence. Veterans avoided speaking of the gun by name. Museums displayed it under glass, captioned, not as a weapon, but as an artifact of design. Students examined its mechanism in engineering schools, unaware of the screams it once accompanied. Its story was no longer about who built it, but about what it revealed. That even in collapse, human ingenuity seeks perfection, and perfection without morality becomes horror. There were myths, too, folklore that lingered in ruined towns. Some villagers in the Ardennes swore that on quiet winter mornings when fog rolled low across the valleys, you could still hear the buzzsaw's faint rhythm, like rain on tin roofs, distant and unending. Others spoke of ghosts in the forests near Aachen, of lights flickering where gun nests once stood, of echoes that refused to fade. Perhaps those stories were only ways to explain what men could not forget. Or perhaps history itself has a sound, and it never stops. In official reports, the MG42 was measured in rounds per minute, effective range, mechanical efficiency. But in the hearts of those who lived through it, it was measured in silence afterward. The silence that followed each burst. The silence after the last man fell. The silence when victory meant only that you were still breathing. By 1945, the war was over, but the MG42's legend had just begun. Soldiers across Europe spoke its name with awe and dread. For the Allies, it was the machine that defined their fear. For the Germans, it was proof that even in defeat, they had mastered something terrible. For the generations that followed, it was a symbol of how technology could outpace humanity. When the Bundeswehr adopted the MG3 in the 1960s, a direct descendant of the MG42, they kept its heart unchanged. The sound was the same. The speed the same. Engineers called it efficiency. Veterans called it déjà vu. One of them, an old gunner, was asked how it felt to hear that sound again. He paused for a long time before answering. Like hearing a language I once spoke and never wanted to speak again. And that is the echo the war left behind. Not in medals, not in monuments, but in memory. The MG42 was the mechanical ghost of the 20th century, whispering across history, reminding mankind of what it can create when necessity meets obsession. When you listen closely, even now you can hear it. The faint rhythm between thunder and silence. The echo of men who once believed a machine could save them. And the reminder that in war perfection always comes at a human cost. The war faded, but the sound did not. It lingers still somewhere between memory and metal, between history and heartbeat. The MG42, once the voice of a collapsing empire, now lives only in echoes. Its roar turned to myth, its myth turned to lesson. In the quiet of post-war Europe, as the ruins grew moss and the rivers carried away the ash, the world learned to fear silence almost as much as noise. For the men who lived through it, peace felt unnatural, too still, too empty. They'd grown used to rhythm, the chatter of the buzzsaw, the steady percussion of artillery, the background hum of engines. Silence was stranger than chaos. Veterans described waking at night to phantom sounds, the metallic scream of the gun firing through their dreams, a rhythm only they could hear. Time didn't erase it. It only made it fainter, more intimate, like a memory whispered under breath. In the ruins of Berlin, children found shell casings and twisted steel. They played with them, unaware of what they were holding. One boy struck a spent casing against a wall. It rang like a bell, a clear note that cut through the desolation. His mother turned pale and took it from him gently. "Don't," she said. "That sound belongs to the dead." History has a way of breathing through objects. The MG42 became one of them. Museums displayed it behind glass, immaculate, restored, sterile. Visitors stared at it, reading placards about its rate of fire, its engineering perfection, its influence. But the glass could not hold the echo. Because the MG42 was never just a weapon. It was a moment in time when man and machine blurred, when fear became mechanical. The engineers who studied it after the war spoke in admiration. They used words like efficiency, innovation, simplicity. They compared it to the pulse of modern industry. But behind those sterile terms was something more: human envy, perhaps, or awe. Because perfection had come from desperation. The Buzzsaw had been built in a collapsing nation by starving hands under bombing raids, and still it worked flawlessly. That was its final paradox. The more the world burned, the more perfect it became. Some called it beauty, others called it damnation. In the decades that followed, its descendants spoke new languages. The MG3 in West Germany, the M60 in America, the MG58 across NATO lines. Each carried its ancestors' DNA, the rhythm, the recoil, the reliability. Soldiers trained with them without knowing that every pull of the trigger carried a whisper from 1944. A lineage of sound machine to man, generation to generation. But history does not end with machines, it ends with memory. Somewhere in France, a small stone memorial marks the site of an MG42 nest destroyed during the liberation. No grand statues, no flags, just a stone half covered in moss. Etched into it 5 names, Allied soldiers, and beneath them, in smaller script, 2 German names added later by locals who found their bodies after the battle. On certain mornings, the fog rolls across that hill exactly as it did 8 decades ago. Visitors say it's easy to imagine the sound again, the brief, dreadful rhythm before everything fell silent. Perhaps that is why the MG42 endures. Not because it was the fastest or the most efficient, but because it left a sound in history's throat that cannot quite fade. It is the echo of what happens when human skill outruns human purpose, when invention forgets mercy. Every generation rediscovers that truth in its own way. In Korea, in Vietnam, in deserts and mountains, soldiers still speak of the roar of automatic fire as if it were alive. They give their weapons names. They form rituals around them, loading, cleaning, caressing the metal before battle. The machine becomes a companion, a charm against death. Just as it was in 1944. The Buzzsaw's lesson then is not just about war, it's about memory. How easily fear turns to fascination. How quickly tragedy becomes design. The MG42 taught the world that progress without reflection can be as dangerous as any bullet. And yet mankind never stopped building faster, better, deadlier echoes. Because somewhere deep down, the sound of control, the illusion of mastery still calls to us. In archives, one Allied officer's diary remains. He'd seen too much, lost too much, and in his final entry written in April 1945, he described stumbling upon a captured MG42. I picked it up, he wrote, and it felt alive. Warm like a heartbeat. The war will end soon, but this sound will not. It will find its way into the next one, and the one after that. He was right. Today, the MG42 sits silent in museums, in collections, in fields buried beneath wildflowers. Its story has become data statistics footage. But when the wind sweeps through the Ardennes, when thunder rolls over the Rhine, when train tracks hum in the distance, some still swear they hear it. A faint, mechanical rhythm. A reminder. That's the echo we live with, the sound of our own creation. Not evil, not good, just human. Built from fear, perfected by need, remembered by those who survived. The MG42 is gone. Yet its pulse remains in the films we make, the games we play, the documentaries we narrate. It hums beneath the surface of every story about war and machinery, and men who thought they could outlast both. And maybe that's why we return to it. Not for the noise, but for the silence that follows. for the moment after the burst when smoke clears and the world takes its first breath again. Listen. You can almost hear it. Not the weapon, but the memory. The whisper of an empire collapsing. The heartbeat of a generation fading into history. Some lessons were written in smoke and steel, others in silence. And this one still echoes.